On Seahawks, your daily Seattle Seahawks podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Greetings, 12s. This is Corbin Smith, your host for Locked On Seahawks. Joining me as always for our Tuesday show, my co-host in crime, Rob Rang. We are now just 5 days away from the regular season opener, and John Schneider decided to make a flurry of news today. In fact, I don't know that we've ever seen the general manager make this many moves only a few days before the season opener. So Rob and I will be breaking those moves down. Plus, we'll be pulling back the curtain and taking a look at Seattle's upcoming Week 1 opponent, the Indianapolis Colts, beginning our coverage for this week's game. This episode is brought your way by Rock Auto. Amazing selection, reliably low prices, all the parts your car will ever need. Visit rockauto.com and tell them Locked On sent you. Now for your lead story here on Locked On Seahawks. Rob, it's John Schneider's world when it comes to roster churning, and we're just living in it. Today, making a flurry of moves, both on the active roster as well as the practice squad, a few injured reserve designations as well. Really no surprises based on what we heard from Carroll yesterday following Monday's practice. Colby Parkinson dealing with a broken foot, still working his way back, as well as Trey Brown and Nigel Warrior, both of them dealing with injuries. All three of those players were placed in injured reserve. They will miss a minimum of 3 games. So the Seahawks had 3 roster spots open. They were able to elevate receiver Penny Hart as well as tight end Tyler Mabry, cornerback John Reed, and they signed Bless Austin, a move we talked about yesterday. They'd been reported earlier, but had not happened yet. So they find the replacement for Nigel Warrior now, who's only been with the team for a week. Whew. And that's not all the moves, but in a nutshell, those are the players that got elevated to the practice squad, or from the practice squad to the active roster. And if you remember the initial 53-man roster a week ago, if you put the two of them together, the roster now and what it looked like then, aside from the star players at the top, it's going to be unrecognizable at this point.
Yeah, it is, but I think that that's what we should expect. I mean, the Seahawks, of course, have struggled throughout most of the preseason. You know, obviously dropping the first two games by ugly scores, and we've talked so much about the concerns at the cornerback and at the along the offensive line and the depth at wide receiver, the depth at tight end. So to me, it wasn't surprising to see John Schneider continue to compete. This is what John Schneider does, as you just said. It's kind of his world, or we're all just kind of living in it and reacting off of it. And I really like these moves. Obviously, you have some concerns about the fact that Colby Parkinson, Trey Brown, and Nigel Warrior all had to go on to injured reserve. And as you mentioned, that means that they are out for 3 weeks. So it obviously does not mean that they are out for too long, but I do like the players that Seattle brought up to the 53-man roster. Penny Hart, we talked about. We just love his versatility, his quickness, his instincts, and his rapport with Russell Wilson. I think that makes a lot of sense against a really physical Indianapolis Colts defense that we're going to be breaking down a little bit later. Tyler Mabry, we talked about that with the tight end position. Obviously, with Parkinson going down, you wanted to elevate somebody else who's going to be able to play that kind of a role, and Tyler Mabry certainly can do that. And then with John Reed and Bless Austin, we've talked about before, these are 2 legitimate cover corners who have struggled a little bit with durability in their short NFL careers, but they do have true cover corner potential, man-to-man kind of skills, and that makes a lot of sense considering the Seahawks are kind of going into this game a little bit blind, Corbin, in the sense that you have a quarterback in Carson Wentz, who is obviously new to the Indianapolis Colts, and he's going to be throwing into brand new wide receivers. You want to make sure that you have the big guys up front to be able to slow down their running game. And so if you have the cover corners on the outside, then that makes a little bit more sense. So I think that all of these moves make some sense. And oh, by the way, a couple of interesting practice squad signings as well. Gavin Heslop returning to the team, a player that you and I have both talked about. And then Tanner Muse, just yesterday we were speaking about him with the Las Vegas Raiders, a kind of a surprise 3rd-round selection a couple of years ago that was released. The Seahawks bringing him in, I think that he just adds more speed, more versatility to that linebacker core. So again, I think that this is a big move for the Seahawks to be as active as they were, and all of these moves make sense, at least in my opinion. It doesn't feel at all like they are just trying to figure out their roster. I think that they are being very strategic. That they recognize that the NFL season is about to start, and I think the Seahawks are getting ready.
And I talked yesterday about where my skepticism lies with this cornerback group, but I will give John Schneider this. Immediately after Trey Brown suffered his knee sprain in the second preseason game, he went out and he got John Reed from the Texans. He was able to pluck him away from Houston for a conditional 7th-round pick. And from what I've been told, he has to dress and play in 6 regular season games for that draft pick to go to the Texans. So who knows how long he's going to end up being on the roster. But if he ends up being a player that they can count on the secondary, I think they'll be more than happy to give up a 7th-round draft pick for him. So this really is a win-win situation for them. If he doesn't pan out, they can cut him, put him in the practice squad, and you've got a player that's not going to end up costing you a draft pick. If he ends up being a really solid addition to your secondary with all the turnover they've had there, then it's a real big win, because all you gave up was a 7th-round pick for a 25-year-old that is just going to keep getting better. And so it's a good situation for the Seahawks there. And Bless Austin has started 16 games for the Jets the last 2 years. He struggled at times in those 16 games, but he's got the long 32-plus inch arms they like. He can play physical on the outside. He's a very solid run defender. He's gotten really solid run defense grades for Pro Football Focus. So he's somebody that can fit the void that I think they thought maybe Nigel Warrior could fit in this competition. So you're getting some players that are kind of interchangeable with the players that are now out injured, and the Seahawks have been able to do that. And so from that regard, these are solid moves. And I like the practice squad additions too. Gavin Hetzlip to me was the one corner. This is why I was a little surprised it took this long to get him back in the practice squad. He was the one corner in the preseason that I felt kind of separated himself a little bit from some of the other players that were competing for roster spots. He was the only corner that I can say exceeded expectations, at least in my opinion. I thought he played pretty well in the preseason games, showed more versatility than I expected, playing some out of the slot in training camp practices and the preseason finale. So getting him back, and Tanner Mew is a player that you and I were both very high on coming out of Clemson. I loved him as a safety prospect. I know that he's moved to linebacker at this point at 230 pounds, but he ran a 4.41 40-yard dash. This dude could move. And by the way, he had 7 interceptions in his college career starring for Clemson. So this is not just a big-bodied guy that can only defend from the box. He has shown that he can make plays on the football. He had 15 pass breakups along with those 7 interceptions. And so I expect that he's going to stay at linebacker with the Seahawks in their practice squad. But after losing Ben Burke-Irvin, they really needed another young linebacker they could develop to go with Aaron Doncourt and John Radigan. They now have all 3 of those players on the practice squad. So I think that these are 2 very interesting practice squad signings for the Seahawks, getting 2 guys that could potentially play their way into playing some snaps on defense at some point for the Seahawks during the 2021 season. When we come back in the second quarter, it's Throwback Tuesday, returning just in time for the regular season. The Colts and the Seahawks, being out of conference opponents, don't play each other very often. We're going to look back at the previous 2 times they faced off during the Pete Carroll era in 2013 and 2017. Don't go away. You're listening to the Locked On Seahawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's that time of year again, and all eyes are now turning to football as teams are back on the gridiron to start the season. As always, BetOnline is your #1 spot for all the pro and college football action this season. Get all the updated odds, props, and contests, including online's biggest $500,000 NFL mega contest and the world's largest $200,000 NFL Survivor contest, now up on BetOnline. Head to the website or use your mobile device to sign up today and receive your 100% welcome bonus. Be sure to take advantage of their opening day super promo. Make a bet on Thursday, September 9th, the season opener between the Buccaneers and the Cowboys. And if you lose, your wager will be refunded up to $25 for new customers only when signing up and using the promo code NFL100. BetOnline is the fastest and easiest way to bet on your favorite sports, whether it's football, basketball, boxing, or your favorite Vegas casino games. Don't wait and take advantage of all the great offers available for the upcoming 2021 season. BetOnline, your online sportsbook experts. Welcome back to the Locked On Seahawks podcast, Tuesday edition. I'm your host, Corbin Smith, joined as always by Rob Rang, back by popular demand. Believe it or not, we've had plenty of listeners asking over the past few months, where's Throwback Tuesday? Where's Throwback Tuesday? We decided to take a little hiatus from it during the offseason, but it is back with a vengeance here for the regular season. Rob, we're going to look back at the last two times that the Seahawks and Colts faced off. Being out-of-conference opponents, they only play every 4 years, so this is going to be the first time they've faced each other since 2017 when the Seahawks hosted the Colts in prime time. They also played in 2013. We're going to start in the way back time machine. The year the Seahawks won the Super Bowl, they went 13-3 that year, but one of those losses happened to be at Lucas Oil Stadium, and it stinks that I'm saying this, but this was the only time that we ever got to see Russell Wilson and Andrew Luck face off against each other. Luck missed the entire 2017 season, so he did not play in that second matchup. And as we know, he retired a few years ago due to the constant injuries that he was dealing with. So we got to see these two great quarterbacks face off against each other just one time. And man, was that a crazy game at Lucas Oil with the Seahawks losing 34-28. It was a thriller, and the Colts ended up being the ones that came out on top that day.
Yeah, it was a fascinating game. I mean, it was a game that I thought that might have been a kind of a Super Bowl preview because, as you mentioned, the Seahawks would go on to go to Super Bowl that season, and the Indianapolis Colts were 4-1 after their victory over the Seahawks, and it was a close battle. I mean, this is the game that the Seahawks jumped out in front, 12-7 after the first quarter, had a 19-17 lead at the half, and then, as you mentioned, the Indianapolis Colts were able to win at the end. They went, scored 11 points in the fourth quarter, whereas the Seahawks were shut out and wound up winning this game 34-28. To me, anytime I think about this game and the Indianapolis Colts, when it was the Andrew Luck show, I remember Andrew Luck, obviously. But I also remember a dynamic receiver who is still on the Indianapolis Colts, but unfortunately from a scouting perspective, from a general NFL perspective, unfortunately, T.Y. Hilton is not going to be able to play against the Seahawks this weekend. From a Seahawks perspective, that's great news because T.Y. Hilton is one of the great playmakers in the league, and in my opinion, has been for a long, long time, and he certainly was against the Seahawks that day. 2 different touchdowns, both of them 30-plus yarders. It was the 70-yarder, 73-yarder in the early second or in the late portion of the first quarter that got the Colts really rolling and completely changed this game. As I mentioned before, Seattle jumped out to a 12-point lead. That was the Stephen Hauschka field goal. It was a 10-yard pass from Russell Wilson to Golden Tate. Talk about kind of going back in time a little bit. But again, Andrew Luck and T.Y. Hilton, one of the great, young quarterbacks at that time, throwing to one of the great speed receivers that time. That's the way the Colts were able to get back into this football game.
This game is dating me a little bit. It feels really weird saying that because I'm only 32 years old, but I mean, I had just got out of college like 6 months earlier, and I was in attendance at this game. This is long before I delved into the realm of becoming an NFL beat writer. I was just in attendance to watch the game. I lived an hour north of Lucas Oil Stadium, and so this was a great opportunity to be able to see 2 really good young quarterbacks go against each other on Super Bowl contenders. The Colts absolutely looked like a team on that particular day that could have made it to the Super Bowl. The Seahawks ended up playing the Broncos. We know how that game unfolded in Seattle's favor. But on this particular afternoon, the Colts were the better football team. Even though Seattle started off with a 12-0 lead, they got a blocked punt that turned into a safety. What I do remember most vividly is that this is the game, I would say it was one of the worst, if not the worst games that Richard Sherman played in a Seahawks uniform. He was the one that was on the receiving end of the 73-yard touchdown downfield to T.Y. Hilton from Andrew Luck. He gave up the other touchdown to Hilton in coverage too. Easily the worst game of his time in Seattle. When you look at a yardage standpoint, the touchdowns he gave up, he obviously bounced back nicely the rest of the season, but that was one of the few games where he had a lot of trouble. He was dealing with that really fast receiver on the outside. Those are the kind of players that could occasionally give Richard Sherman issues during the prime of his career. So I remember that, and I also remember really the play that changed this game. You could say that 73-yard bomb did. It certainly got the Colts awakened a little bit. They looked like they were sleepwalking the first quarter of this game. But a blocked field goal by Steven Hauschka. It was taken back to the house, 61 yards for a touchdown, and suddenly a game that was 12-0 is now 14-12. The Colts take the lead, and after that point, it was really a back-and-forth affair, but that was really the play, in my opinion, that changed things, and ultimately what cost the Seahawks in this game. They weren't able to get any points in the fourth quarter. They also had 3 drives in the second half that looked promising that they just could not sustain and had to take field goals. If they could have got a touchdown on a couple of those drives, it would have changed the game completely, but they just weren't able to do that. They had 4 different drives, their opening drive in the game as well, that sputtered. Once they got past midfield, they were able to tack on 3 points, but 3 is a lot worse than 7 when you do it 4 different times. That ultimately cost them this in this game, and the Seahawks, one of the 3 losses they had that entire regular season, happened at Lucas Oil. Now let's fast forward to the more recent game in 2017, and this one on the scoreboard was not close. It was a 46-18 victory for the Seahawks in primetime, but we know every Seahawks game is going to be weird in some way, shape, or form, and this was no different. It was actually a 2-point lead for the Colts at halftime, and it was a 5-point lead, actually. It was 15-10. It was one of those weird scoregami type scores at halftime, and the Colts were quarterbacked by Jacoby Brissett in that game. Andrew Luck missed the entire season. Again, Wilson and Luck only faced each other one time in their respective NFL careers. It's unfortunate that that's the case, but Brissett and the Colts were game. They came out, the first quarter ended 3-2 was the score, and it was 15-10 at half. Just a really bizarre first half, and the Colts looked like they were primed for the upset, and then the avalanche happened in the second half, and really what sparked it, it's a play that I had to go back before we started the show and just make sure that I remembered correctly, and it absolutely happened. Russell Wilson scrambles 23 yards, dives helmet first into the end zone, gets up and hands out a couple expletives in excitement, things that you never thought you would see lip synced out of Russell Wilson's mouth, and it just fired up the entire football team. I don't know that I've ever seen him quite like that at any other moment, and that really sparked the Seahawks. And they ended up scoring 36 points in the second half of that game, and it was a rout. The rout was on. 46-18 final score. The Colts scored 3 points in the second half, were held to under 160 passing yards. So when you consider how the game ended from that perspective, this was an outstanding primetime win. They were able to bounce back from a pretty sluggish first 2 quarters and really turned in a dominant second half. Unfortunately for me, and I'm sure you share the same sentiments, I can't look back at that game, though, and want to talk most about the final outcome from a score standpoint. There were some very significant injuries in that game for the Seahawks, and really this was the tale of the 2017 season, the only year in the last 9 years they haven't made the playoffs.
Yeah, that's the thing. Is there is a lot of things, if you just look at the box score, a lot of things that are very exciting about this game. As you mentioned, Corbin, especially after going back to the game that the Seahawks had lost to the Colts 4 years prior and were unable to score touchdowns, and then to explode for 6 touchdowns in this game from the second quarter on and make this game an absolute blowout, 46-18. But at the same, and it was an exciting game. Seattle had some incredible plays. Russell Wilson, the touchdown that you just mentioned, 2 defensive touchdowns. Justin Coleman returning interception, 28 yards for Seattle's first score, Seattle's first touchdown of the game. That gave them the lead at 10-2. And then a little bit later, Bobby Wagner had a 21-yard fumble return of his own. So there were some definite highlights in this game, as you expect with a game at 46-18 at CenturyLink Field, and the Seahawks, having the performance that they did. But at the same time, as you mentioned, it was also a game that had some ugly injuries. The most important, of course, being what wound up becoming the career ender for Cliff Averill, which obviously was just heartbreaking because we know what a terrific football player that he is or was for the Seahawks and previously in Detroit. And I remember him back at Purdue. And then, of course, there was also an injury to Chris Carson. It's interesting. You go back over the box score of this game. It was, it wasn't Chris Carson who wound up leading the Seahawks in rushing this game. It wasn't the aforementioned Russell Wilson. It was Eddie Lacy
His
who
one
wound up
defining game.
exactly. And so it was one of those kind of games. It kind of sticks in your memory for a lot of different reasons. But as you mentioned, the most important one being the loss of Cliff Averill and what an impact that he had made for the Seahawks both on and off the field.
Yeah, those two injuries really sullied the momentum of this victory. And really, like I said, it just kind of was the starting point for what was a year full of injuries. Later in the year, Richard Sherman tears his Achilles. Last game that he played in a Seahawks uniform. Cam Chancellor suffers a career-ending neck injury of his own in the same game in Arizona. The Seahawks were just ravaged by injuries. And I will still maintain that if the Seahawks were able to keep at least one or two of those guys healthy in the season, I don't think they missed the playoffs. It was one of those things where there were a few games they ended up losing during the middle and latter stages of the season that it was just a state of attrition. They had just lost too many good players, especially on the defensive side of the football. They were getting to be an older football team, so injuries are going to come with that, unfortunately. And so losing Averill, that was a major blow for this pass rush. They had to go out and get Dwight Freeney for a few games. They were trying to find replacements and really struggled to do that. And losing Chris Carson ultimately might have been the bigger loss there because they were playing musical chairs with running backs the remainder of the season. And we know at the end of the year, that was easily the worst season the Seahawks have had running the football. If I remember correctly, they did not have a running back with over 250 rushing yards in 2017. And that was one of the big reasons that they didn't make the playoffs. They just had no balance. It was all the Russell Wilson show. The defense was struggling, especially late in the year with all the injuries they had. So there was a snowball effect after this game. So it was great to win on the scoreboard, to dominate in the second half, but it was a very costly victory, both short and long term for the Seahawks. When we come back in the third quarter, we're going to zip back to the present. The Seahawks getting ready to travel to Indianapolis to face the Colts at Lucas Oil Stadium. We're going to look at what's new in our Enemy Confidential as we start to break down Seattle's Week 1 opponent. You're listening to the Locked On Seahawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. With the ever-increasing numbers of makes and models, it's now impossible for your local chain auto parts store to stock all the parts you need. Why endure the often pointless or seemingly intimidating questioning and wait while the person behind the counter orders the parts in your computer, choosing the only brand their warehouse happens to carry? You have computers with access to rockauto.com at your home and in your pocket. Why choose to spend 30%, 50%, even 100% more for the same parts from a chain store or car dealership? Rock Auto is a family business serving do-it-yourselfers for over 20 years. They have everything you could need. Brake parts, tail lamps, motor oil. They even had a new steering wheel cover for my Dodge Charger. Go to rockauto.com right now and see all the parts available for your car and truck. Right, Locked On in there. How did you hear about us box? So they know we sent you. Amazing selection, reliably low prices, all the parts your car will ever need. rockauto.com. Put yourself in this scenario. You've got one device that lets you catch the game live, another that lets you stream your favorite shows. You're watching sports highlights on your phone, and you've got your neighbor's best friend's login for the good stuff. Well, I want to tell you a simple way to avoid that entertainment chaos without all the hassle, and a great way to finally get your TV together. It's called DirecTV Stream, and it brings your live TV and on-demand favorites together like never before, so you can watch your favorite sports, movies, and shows all in one place. That means no more juggling remotes, no need to buy another device ever again. And the best part, there's no annual contract. So get rid of the clutter and the confusion and get your TV together with DirecTV Stream. You can learn more at directv.com. That's directv.com. Welcome back to the Locked On Seahawks podcast, Tuesday edition. I'm your host, Corbin Smith, joined as always by Rob Rang. We are finally to the start of the regular season. It's time to start breaking down the Seahawks' opening week opponent, the Indianapolis Colts. Rob, we're going to start by taking a look back at the 2020 season in review for the Colts. And I'll admit, this is one of the teams last year going into the playoffs that I thought might have a chance to be a dark horse Super Bowl contender, the way they were playing late in the season. And I just loved the way they were playing, the style. This is a team that was very physically imposing. They would run the football down your throat. Phillip Rivers was still good enough that he could carry an offense when he needed to, had 24 passing touchdowns last year, the final season of his NFL career. They had enough intriguing weapons on the outside to at least be a formidable passing attack. arguably the best offensive line in the NFL, led by Quentin Nelson, and a defense that was top 10 in points and yards allowed per game. So this was a team that looked to have all the momentum, and they nearly beat the Buffalo Bills in the wild card round, had them on the ropes, came up just short, just like many of the passes that Phillip Rivers threw in that game, and they lost 27-24. And really that ushered in a very important offseason for Chris Ballard and Frank Reich going into the 2021 season with Phillip Rivers retiring. They knew they needed to upgrade the quarterback position. But nonetheless, this is a team that a year ago emerged as one of the better teams in the AFC and one that travels well in the playoffs given their style.
Yeah, that's the thing. I thought you did a great job of kind of explaining how the Colts did. I mean, finishing 11-5 a year ago, second in the AFC South. I mean, it really was an impressive performance by the Indianapolis Colts. And I think that you have to focus in on a couple of players here. Phillip Rivers, of course, as you mentioned, quite possibly a future Hall of Famer. At least he is in my book. And certainly he did not have the arm strength at the end of his career that he had earlier. But at the same time, just his competitiveness, just his willingness to attempt throws that other quarterbacks were not willing. And then there's no question the impact that Jonathan Taylor had for the Colts, the rookie running back, who was struggling a little bit earlier in the season, but my goodness, once he started building momentum for the Indianapolis Colts behind that terrific offensive line, then they really were rolling. And of course, Seahawks fans know one of the great defensive linemen in the NFL that previously been at the San Francisco 49ers, DeForest Buckner, comes over to the Colts, winds up becoming an all-pro for them, led the club with 9.5 sacks, playing both defensive tackle as well as defensive end. You know, he had been such a superstar with the San Francisco 49ers previously in his career. It just seemed like with the addition of these veterans, Rivers and Buckner, it felt like the Colts completely changed their mentality. I mean, they were the aggressors. They were the physical football team. This is a very different team than, some of the Indianapolis Colts that we had, squads that we had seen previously with Andrew Luck or with Peyton Manning that were more about, I don't want to say gimmicky, but they were a little bit more of a finesse passing offense. This Indianapolis Colts offense a year ago, and the defense as well, would punch you in the mouth a little bit. And that's what's going to make this a little bit of a fascinating game, in my opinion, from the Seahawks perspective. Can Seattle handle the physicality that the Indianapolis Colts are going to be bringing? Obviously, you have a brand new quarterback here in Carson Wentz, but I'm eager to break this one down, Corbin, because I really think that this is a really, really big game. Obviously, it's the opener, but it's more than that. These are two teams who in a lot of ways are very, very similar, and I'm curious to see who's going to be the more physical, more aggressive team. I have no doubt in my mind that's the team that's going to emerge victorious on Sunday.
As we have always done in this podcast, we're going to start with more of the in general information about the team today, looking at what's new, additions, departures, and of course, some inside the numbers from a year ago with this Indianapolis Colts squad. And then we'll break down matchups to watch on our Wednesday episode. And then on Friday, one of the favorite segments our listeners absolutely love that we'll be bringing back for the regular season. It's time to game plan how the Seahawks can be victorious over the Colts at Lucas Oil Stadium. So let's break down, just pulling back the curtain. Let's look at some of the changes for this Colts team. You mentioned the name Carson Wentz. As I said, it was a critical offseason for the Colts because they knew there was a chance Phillip Rivers was either not going to be back by their choice or he was going to retire. He opted to retire, is now coaching high school football. So he stayed in the sport. He's moved on from his career. They traded for Carson Wentz, who obviously has a relationship previously with Frank Reich when he was with the Philadelphia Eagles. And when they were together, that was when Carson Wentz was at his very best. And obviously the last 2 years, he has not been. That's why the Eagles traded him, really struggled with durability and was not near as accurate. A lot of turnover issues in the past 2 seasons with an Eagles squad that had a lot of other injury issues on offense that affected his play as well. So they're hoping that they can make Carson Wentz one of the biggest reclamation projects in the league this year, that he can get back to his 2017 MVP caliber form and lead this offense that has a lot of weapons. They also brought in Eric Fisher, who was recovering from an Achilles injury. I don't think he plays this week, given he just got activated from the COVID list and just got cleared to practice. I would think he's going to miss at least a couple games. And they've got some injury issues at the tackle position. But Fisher was one of the more notable additions they made this offseason. And then their first-round pick, Kwity Paye, coming out of Michigan, pass rusher, had some really good plays early in training camp, injured his ankle. Sounds like he's got a really good chance to be able to play in this season opener, so the Seahawks might get to see the new pass rusher trying to go after Russell Wilson. But really, otherwise, this is a pretty quiet offseason for the Colts, and Chris Ballard, this has kind of been his MO, not super active in free agency for the most part, and they use the draft to try to fill a number of different holes.
Yeah, and you highlighted some of the additions to the Colts roster. Let's focus on some of the losses to that roster. I mean, they lost a Pro Bowl left tackle in Anthony Costanzo, besides Phillip Rivers. So their left tackle and their quarterback obviously no longer on the team, as is two of their best pass rushers. I mentioned before DeForest Buckner, and again, if it sounds like I am just gushing over DeForest Buckner, believe me, I haven't even begun to gush about DeForest Buckner. I think he is one of the most underrated defenders in all of the NFL. If he is playing in New York, if he's playing in Dallas, this would be a perennial All-Pro. I really think he's a terrific player, but they lost Justin Houston, or allowed him to leave, I should say, and Danico Autry as well. I mean, that's roughly 18 sacks between the two of them. So two of their better pass rushers. It made sense that they went with a still very raw defensive lineman in Kwity Paye, one who I think has an unbelievable upside, an unbelievable story as well. I certainly am rooting for the young man, but he is raw. This is a Colts team that is physical. I don't know if they're quite as talented as they were on the edges, and that's on the defensive side, but it's also the tackle. As you mentioned, with Eric Fisher coming off of the COVID list and off of a torn Achilles. And this is the number 1 overall pick years ago with the Kansas City Chiefs. But, of course, they cut bait after Fisher, and the rest of that Kansas City offensive line really struggled against Tampa Bay in the Super Bowl. Sam Tevy was the left tackle that the Colts had brought in to be the replacement left tackle for Anthony Costanzo, and he got injured, former Charger starter. So to me, we talk so much about Seattle and their concerns at the cornerback and center position. For the Indianapolis Colts, Corbin, all offseason, their biggest concern was left tackle, and they did not do an adequate enough job, at least in my opinion, to replace that. And you have a quarterback in Carson Wentz who is absolutely talented, and I do have a great deal of, hope that he is going to wind up becoming the player that he flashed that he could be previously when he was with Frank Reich. But at the same time, I also remember Carson Wentz, the last time the Seahawks played, when Carson Wentz was in Philadelphia, that he was missing running backs in the flat. He looked like a shadow of himself. And so without the consistent protection that the Colts have offered at the tackle position in the past, this could be a game where the Seahawks pass rush, if it's as good as we hope, the Seahawks pass rush could be able to get to Carson Wentz. It's going to be a fascinating matchup.
Let's look inside the numbers here. As you mentioned, Tevy's out for the season. They also have T.Y. Hilton expected to miss the first 3 games of the year as well. He had surgery on his neck. They're expecting him to be back at some point, but he will not be playing in this game. So one of their top receivers will not be available for Carson Wentz against Seattle's secondary as well. But going inside the numbers, some things from 2020, as you would expect of a team that was 11-5, most of the numbers here are really good ones for the Colts, and there's a reason why they finished the way that they did and had the Bills on the ropes in the wild card round. A couple that jumped out to me, most notably, they allowed just 21 sacks last year on Phillip Rivers, who was always able to find ways to get the football out quick, and that was part of it. But this is an outstanding offensive line led by Quentin Nelson, not just in the run blocking department, but pass protection as well. That was with Anthony Costanzo, though, as you mentioned. That's a huge loss for them, and they've had a number of guys they've been trying to fill in. Who knows who's going to be starting at left tackle for them in this opener, but that was the second fewest sacks allowed in the NFL a year ago, giving up just 21 of them. And this is the other one that really jumped out to me. Jonathan Taylor's biggest red flag coming out of Wisconsin was ball security. The Colts running backs as a whole had 1 fumble all of the 2020 season. That was the lowest in the NFL. So they did a great job protecting the football. Not a lot of interceptions from Phillip Rivers. didn't have fumble issues from their running backs. And so that's something to keep in mind in this game, though I will add the caveat again. Jonathan Taylor did have some issues coughing up the football at the college level playing for Wisconsin. And one last stat I'd like to look at on offense here that I think is interesting. Last year, they ranked 21st in the NFL in red zone percentage at just a little over 53%. So just a little over half the time they got inside the 20, they got touchdowns. The Seahawks were far more efficient in that regard. So this was an offense led by Phillip Rivers that had some really good moments. They put up big yardage, but weren't necessarily great at finishing drives a year ago.
They were not. And one of the things that did help them is while they were not able to finish drives with touchdowns, they do have one of the better young kickers in the league in Rodrigo Blankenship. A guy that I thought had a really impressive rookie season for the Colts. I thought was kind of one of the underrated elements of their surprising play a year ago. 11-5, as you mentioned, put the Buffalo Bills on the ropes. And so between Jonathan Taylor and Rodrigo Blankenship, they really had a significant impact from the rookie class a year ago. I don't know that you're going to see that same type of immediate impact from this year's rookie class. We mentioned Kwity Paye, who is a little bit raw. Dayo Adebango is a defensive lineman from Vanderbilt that the Colts selected, I think, wisely, relatively early in last year's draft. But at the same time, he was coming off of a major injury, suffered right before the draft. He's not going to be ready to play in this game. And so I think that the Colts basically are who they are. And so, again, I think that it's an interesting matchup for the Seahawks. And I think that the statistics are impressive when you look at who the Colts were. I'm curious to see, as we all are, what the Colts are going to be when it's Carson Wentz who's going to be hanging off the ball to Jonathan Taylor rather than Phillip Rivers, and all the experience that Rivers, the savviness that he was able to provide the Colts a year ago. I don't know that Carson Wentz can duplicate that for the Colts. So that, to me, makes the Indianapolis Colts one of the most fascinating teams in all of the NFL. I think the Seahawks are fortunate to be playing this team early, because if they do start to develop some momentum, and I think they can, I think this could be a formidable team come November and December.
Yeah, I think this team has Super Bowl potential if Carson Wentz can rediscover his prior form, what he played like in 2016 and 2017. If Frank Reich can unlock that out of Carson Wentz and he can stay healthy, there are some big ifs there. They've got the pieces in place, especially with that offensive line, assuming they can figure out what's going on at left tackle. I'm just as curious about the defense, though, because you mentioned the losses that they've had to their pass rush, and Kwity Paye has a lot of upside, but who knows what he's going to look like because of how raw of a talent that this kid is. They didn't really add anyone else to that pass rush, rushing off the edge. And so I look at their stats. Like last year, they had a 6.5% sack rate, which was respectable, 11th overall in the NFL. But that was with Justin Houston and Nico Autry. How much does that change with those two not being there? And I don't think, and we'll talk about this a lot more on upcoming shows this week, but I don't think the secondary is a strength for this football team either. And so if they're not getting the same pressure on the quarterback, I got to wonder what that means for a secondary that ranked 10th in the NFL as far as 10th most 20-plus yard pass plays last year. They were pretty good at not giving up 40-plus yard explosives, but they had their issues with chunk plays that were 20-plus yards, and that was with the pass rush that they had a year ago. And so I'm curious to see what the defense looks like. They're coached really well. They've got a lot of talent with Darius Leonard as well as DeForest Buckner. Those two players, all-pro talents, and they've got some other good players around them. But it feels like there could be some areas to exploit. And so we'll be looking at some of those key matchups and, of course, game planning on our Wednesday and Friday episodes of Locked On Seahawks. Betting on the NFL doesn't have to be a guessing game if you listen to the new Locked On Bets podcast hosted by your boy Q and handicapping expert Lee Sterling. Get daily picks, blowout specials, wrong team favorite picks, and Lee Sterling's Lock of the Day. Follow the Locked On Bets podcast brought to you by betonline.ag, wherever you get podcasts. When we return on our Wednesday show, Rob and I are going to be checking out 5 key matchups to watch in this season opener. We'll be looking at some Seahawks offense versus Colts defense and vice versa. Some matchups that are going to ultimately decide who wins this season opener at Lucas Oil Stadium. Hope you'll be tuning in. Enjoy the rest of your Tuesday. Go Hawks.